This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everybody. I suspect we'll get a few more people joining us shortly, but we'll just go ahead and get started because we only have an hour and a ton of content. So hello to anyone I have not met before. My name is Riley Loveland, and I'm the chair of the Portland Green Schools Committee here. Welcome to our first ever virtual event. Like many of you, I'm sure you went through a big strategic plan to get all of your events and have them in person and exciting and tangible, and yet have had to go to the virtual world. So welcome to our first ever virtual event. We apologize if there's any technical issues. Just let us know if there's anything that you need help with during this event. So before we dive in, I'm going to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items. All of you are currently muted. Please be mindful of this because you're all actually able to unmute yourselves. You'll have a chance to unmute and ask questions, make comments, do all those things during the last portion of this panel, but just please be mindful that you are muted now. So we'll kick this event off with some short presentations from our panelists, so you can see on screen here. During these presentations, feel free to send questions or comments via the chat box. It's on the right-hand side of your screen towards the bottom. If you do not see it there, please let us know in some way. I would say type it into the chat box, but if not, you can email us at greenschools.portland@gmail.com. I've got it on my phone right here. Once the presenters, like I said, conclude, you'll all have an option to unmute yourselves and ask questions directly. We want this to be more of a dialogue as opposed to just a straight up webinar. So if you do choose to speak, though, please make sure that you say your name and maybe your organization, just so we know and we can have an actual in-person conversation. If you do wish to just ask questions via the chat, you're welcome to, and we're happy to read them to our presenters. So go ahead and do that as they're presenting, do it after they're presenting. The chat box is an open dialogue for all of you. And if you see on your screen, if you're looking at our faces here in the GoToMeeting viewer, at the top, it likely says everyone. If you want to click on that and drop down to who is talking, that way you can see the face of the actual presenter, or you can just leave it on everyone too. And if you have any technical issues during the session, please just put it in the chat box and I'll follow up with you. This session is being recorded and slides will be sent out after the event concludes. We'll also be sending a post-event survey for your feedback, which we would very much appreciate. As I mentioned, this is our first virtual event. We want to make it the best it can be because we have another one coming up in July and another virtual panel series planned for after that. All right, go to the next slide here. Excellent. So before we get to our content, I want to brief you all on who the Portland Green Schools Committee is. We're this dedicated group of volunteers made up of design professionals, built environment experts, school district staff, sustainability consultants, and other green school advocates. And we meet once a month to develop strategies, such as events like these, to advocate for greener and healthier schools. And, you know, although we're called the Portland Green Schools Committee, we do extend as far south, east, or west as our expertise is needed. We've had people call us from Bend, people call us from Coos Bay, so we're here to help as needed. And if you're a district looking for support for your sustainability efforts, we are happy to help. Or if you're a design professional or anyone, we have a really great depth of knowledge on this committee. Whoops, too far. There we go. So we have a website in development where this webinar and our other resources will be posted shortly. Feel free to check that out. Like I said, it's in development. It should be done pretty soon. And, you know, although COVID has made our efforts a little less hands-on, in past our committee has helped organize and participated in events such as Days of Service that you can see here, climate strikes, other discussion panels, community fairs, energy and waste audits. We're pretty much here at your disposal as long as it's a sustainability related effort. And for the most up-to-date information on our committee, please follow us on the social media channels here. And in fact, you can check out our saga on Jerry's bees. You'll hear Jerry present later. He had recently adopted a bee colony. You can also sign up for our newsletter. There's a link to sign up here, but it'll also be included in the follow-up email so that you can just click it there. And if you'd like to get involved, we would love to have you. Please email greenschools@portlandor@gmail.com. We do have a meeting this coming Friday, so it's a very Green Schools filled week. And if you're interested, just shoot us a quick email. And so without further ado, let's get to the actual meat or meat substitute of this presentation. And before I introduce our presenters and pass this off, I really want to remind everyone that COVID and how it moves and infects and affects our world is still a really nascent body of knowledge. And the presenters today will showcase the research behind the microbiome, the science behind the infection control in the buildings, and the key factors that play into building-related decision-making. Keep in mind that right now, although there is no perfect answer, we all really wish there was, or guarantee for 100% COVID, pandemic, or climate disaster management, every school district is unique and will have their own approach to this. We invite you to sit back, listen to our presenters, and then ask them the tough questions so that you can make that decision in your district. So let's meet our panelists. Craig is a mechanical engineer at PAE. He has a strong interest in occupant health and well-being, specifically focused on thermal comfort and indoor air quality. He is a PSU alumni, and Craig worked in the Green Building Research Laboratory helping develop air quality sensors and modeling the influx of pollution into buildings. It's a lot of words. In addition to engineering, he's an accredited energy manager and has worked in facilities of multiple large universities. Craig's work currently includes research on indoor airflow dynamics and occupant health. So, I was originally going to introduce all of our panelists at once, but I actually think I'm going to do it in between each of the presentations. So, Craig, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I am Craig. I'm with PAE and wanted to share, I guess, on the research side, more of the practical application of some of the research we've been looking into and gathering, specifically related to our schools projects and what we think, is kind of the best use of some of this information, particularly related to infection risk mitigation. If we can slide, please. Can I get to that? I'm going to briefly go over some of the systems we're recommending and the different factors that are contributing to helping decrease the risk of contamination within an indoor environment, including outside air and filtration, and a lot of what goes into our equipment selection and some of the design work we do. Also touch on some of the germicidal options that are currently available. Slide. So I think first and foremost, I'd like to say, based on everything we're seeing, there's no 100% solution, barring basically a clean room design, which is not practical for any sort of school application. And even before that, I wouldn't say there's a magic bullet that we say, oh, this is obviously what you need in every situation. But typically, as we'll get into, the more outside air is the better. And so we are often recommending dedicated outside air units and for with heat recovery for energy cost savings. A system that decouples your ventilation with your thermal conditioning system will allow you to control your, the outside air amounts related to health without affecting your, the comfort of the occupants, which is important in a lot of regards. Slide. Big concern and probably one of the most important topics is filtration. I'm going to try not to step on Kathleen or Kevin's toes too much, but the main takeaway here, and I understand this is a busy slide for everybody, is that I think the size we're most concerned about is this 0.3 micron. No, yes, maybe. I mean, that seems to be the most difficult size to capture. When you get smaller than that, it seems like a lot of capture rates go up. And then bigger particles are obviously generally easier to capture. And so MERV 14 filters are rated at 95% efficient at catching that 0.3 micron particle size. The main considerations when you're talking about filtration, especially with an existing building, is if you already have an air handler in your existing equipment, what can you actually get in there? What is your filter bank size? And then your system pressure, like if you're starting to like put in a lot of filters, your system may not be able to handle the additional pressure drop. And so in the shoulder season, like if we're talking about in fall, it's probably not going to be as big of an issue in terms of capacity. However, if we're getting into middle of summer or winter, especially in the middle of summer, we're going to really want to look at any sort of system effects. Also the location. We have a couple examples of putting in booster fans, you know, retrofitting with a HEPA filter. I think that's, we're not recommending that. And for our K through 12 applications, we are often just recommending MERV 14 if you can, or MERV 13 minimum, and not HEPA filters. The next slide. As with all of this, I should say there's a kind of cost benefit ratio in terms specifically of energy. And so with the pressure and your fans moving, that's the case. And also with here, your outside air, this is probably our main strategy for K through 12 is trying to get more fresh air inside the building. And so that means increasing your outside air damper position, extended economizer ranges, night purge. If you have demand control ventilation, disabling it and just like getting as much air in there as possible 24/7. So you are constantly kind of refreshing the building. Again, considerations here are cost, right? And it's up to each different group to decide how that necessarily plays out. If we go to the next slide. The next and related strategy is just increased air changes. So in every space, similarly, the more air you're putting in equals the more air you're taking out. In terms of pressures, there's, you know, you want in hospitals and a lot of healthcare applications, you pressurize areas in terms of where you want, and in terms of isolating different areas you'd want to. K through 12, there's not that much of an issue there. Pressurizing corridors, just upping the CFM in those interstitial areas can be somewhat helpful. Overall, we are not really recommending increasing airflow a lot. There's real acoustic issues, especially with overhead diffusers that we commonly have. And so it's worth being mindful, and we typically aren't recommending this as a strategy. Next slide. Similarly for air distribution, so inside a space, how we're delivering air matters. In a perfect world, we'd have a ton of air moving super slowly in this nice smooth flow, and so it comes in one area, just sweeps up all this stuff and leaves in somewhere else. Often that's not the case, especially in schools. You know, we'll have ceiling supplies and ceiling returns. So how that's situated can make a difference. If we want to move returns to low on a wall, that can help to kind of create that kind of separation between where the air is coming in and going out. Displacement ventilation is great if we're talking about new construction or major retrofit. Underfloor air distribution similarly. Existing considerations, again, we're talking about starting to rip up ceilings and move stuff around. So this is more of a retrofit and major TI work than kind of an existing building modification. Slide. And so for the kind of more specific treatment of germicidal, eradication, I guess, two main technologies are UV and ionization. UV, oh, another shaking head. That I'd say we've been working with. The UV we typically see in a duct. You want to be really mindful of the air speed that's going through there. It can really affect the effectiveness of the system. And this is only something that we'd recommend for a very specific application for a vulnerable population. We haven't seen really much use of this in schools. That would be a further conversation and something you'd want to work really closely with consultants and equipment representatives with. Ionization, ionizers we typically do not recommend. I think there's real concern with generation of ozone. I know some products are saying they don't make any ozone. I have not seen that compelling evidence yet, but you know, it's again something just to be mindful of and look more into. Slide. And then the last thing I want to talk about is humidity. It has been shown that really 50% relative humidity is the sweet spot for virus inactivation. And when you start getting higher or lower than that for different reasons, the virus does pretty well. Controlling humidity in indoor environment can be tough. It's easier to dehumidify, which is often not a major concern here. The active humidification can be really costly, can have a lot of maintenance concerns, and so it's just something that's always needs to be considered. Similar to this, if we're talking about schools or any buildings that have been kind of idle for a while, when we're starting up, you want to be mindful of the startup procedure and really do a good job of flushing your systems. There's Legionella and some other stuff can be growing in a building that hasn't been, been active for a while. And so in addition to all of this, I think proper startup procedures need to really be considered when we're talking about reopening institutions. Slide. So the last things quickly I'll go over. All of this, treating the air, and that's really what I'm talking about, is the indoor environmental quality, is only one part of this. When we're like coughing and spewing stuff out, a lot of it's landing on surfaces. And so when we're treating air, it has to be coupled with really cleaning the surfaces as well. And in my mind, you have to be doing both to really have effective risk mitigation. Again, there's no 100% like solid, I can guarantee you nothing will happen answer for any of this. I talked about startups and identifying any particular cases in your building where you'd want to have some sort of special system for special protections. And the last thing is these things come at a cost. And again, this has to be a discussion, especially if we're talking about affecting thermal comfort, which I know is a sticking point for some educators and is always needs to be addressed. I think that's all I have. I'll send it back to you, Riley. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Craig. All right, so I'm going to pass this off to Kevin, but first I'll quickly introduce him. So Kevin van den Wymelenberg is a professor at the University of Oregon. He's the director of both the Institute for Health in the Built Environment and Energy Studies in Buildings Laboratory, as well as co-director of the Biology and the Built Environment Center in Eugene and Portland, Oregon. He has a PhD in Built Environments from the University of Washington, go Huskies. His research areas include daylighting design, integrated design principles, energy performance and air quality, and the microbiome in buildings. Kevin is consulted on several hundred new construction and major renovation projects with architects and engineers regarding energy efficiency and indoor environmental air quality in buildings since 2000. All right, let's see if I can get my slides to advance. There we go. All right, Kevin, it's all you. Kevin, I think you might be muted. See if I can.
I'm mute here, but I think this may be less reliable.
We got you. Give it a shot.
All right, we'll go for it. So I'm switching headphones, sorry. So I don't hear myself talk. All right, thanks everybody. I just wanted to give a shout out to my predecessor, Charlie Brown, and shout out to Joel Loveland, who's maybe related to our moderator here, and he was involved in my education and super valuable guy. I also want to shout out to the woman in blue in the front and the gentleman next to her, Leslie and Patrick, for a lot of the research that you're going to see today. Next slide. We run a group called the Institute for Health in the Built Environment, and it's a kind of unique collaboration between, I'm not seeing the slide advance, but it's a unique collaboration between multiple universities as well as industry. I have the pleasure of working with Craig and PAE in that group, as well as a lot of other industry partners, as you can see there. So that's a little bit about who we are. Next slide. I just want to say that the team has been really busy. We've been studying microbiology for a decade, microbiology in buildings, that is, for a decade, but more recently, we've been focused on coronavirus, obviously. And so the circle on the far left shows a screenshot of a paper that we wrote in early March about ways to reduce transmission risk in indoor environments. I still think it's a really valuable resource. We've rewritten it, I think, 5 times now in subsequent preprints and modifications to the journal article because the world is changing fast. The first draft was actually written before all the stay-at-home orders as a way to vet which buildings maybe you needed to shut first. And now I'd say, as we're kind of reopening the economy, and we know that buildings are the engines of our economy, we can think about that information and unpack some of the things that Craig described so well. We've also been sampling in buildings. So the middle image just shows our team, and Patrick and Leslie in particular, up at the Hill at OHSU, sampling coronavirus indoors. This is built upon a couple of year collaboration looking at other hospital associated infections like C. diff. And I'll go ahead and say next slide, and then describe the image on the right, which we'll show later, is really just a way to try to help visualize all of these complexities, help the unseen become seen. So if this video plays, we'll go with it. If it doesn't, I'll just talk over. But the idea here is that, the microbiome is part of us as humans, and it looks like the video is not playing. That's all right. This one is also a video. I'm not sure if it'll play, but I'll just talk over and we'll see how it goes.
I don't think they're going to play.
We're
Sorry
made up
about
of
that.
trillions of microbes. Our gut microbes regulate our digestion. Our skin microbes can provide immunoprotection effects. By cell count, you're more microbial than you are human. Roughly 5 kilograms of your body is made up of microbial matter. Everything from our skin to the Mars rover is covered with microbes, and that includes our buildings. And we say that understanding the indoor microbiome opens a design opportunity to support health in really unprecedented ways. We've been unintentionally designing our indoor microbiome, but we're learning that you can do these things with more intention. And we were talking about that before coronavirus, but certainly post COVID-19, I think it's all hit us even more directly. Go ahead and next slide. Thanks, Riley. We've learned things about how buildings operate. If this video runs, great. If it doesn't, I'll just explain it. We've learned about the source and pathway of the fresh air that's provided, the relationship of outdoor air exchange and microbes, the activities that happen in specific rooms, and how all of those things shape unique microbial landscapes. So if this video were playing, you'd be able to zoom in on these little lobe charts, and you'd see which bacteria or fungi are present in various space types. And then the video also characterizes the difference between the blue rooms and the green rooms, where the blue rooms were naturally ventilated, or excuse me, the blue rooms were mechanically ventilated, and the green rooms were naturally ventilated, and we saw a greater similarity of and a greater abundance of human-associated microbes in the rooms that were mechanically ventilated. And probably because of dilution and diversity and less filtration, we actually saw greater diversity of microbes in the green rooms and fewer human-associated microbes, which may be a clue to pathogenic microbes. So potentially natural ventilation reduces the number of pathogenic microbes. Next slide. Again, another, the previous slide is a video. I don't know if the video is going to work, but it just shows the history of the work that we did at studying microbes in buildings helped give us confidence to put some visualizations together about how microbes, in particular SARS-CoV-2 or coronavirus, can be aerosolized and caught up in air streams. And so it used the famous Chinese restaurant as an example and just showed how indeed indoor aerosol related transmission is possible well beyond 6 feet, depending on the airflow patterns and the air exchange rates and filtration and all the things that Craig went through. What this slide is showing is some of the work that we're doing on campus at OHSU, and I just want to give them major kudos for allowing this research to be conducted in the first place. It's a vulnerable place to be. We're working very closely with infection prevention to help ensure the greatest safety of the built environment. And I will say, no matter what we see at OHSU, it's not unique to OHSU. This is true in other buildings where there are coronavirus, people infected with coronavirus. It's certainly related to any other hospital environment. So this is the sampling plan, and then the next slide shows some of the results. What's interesting here is these results are for spaces that were empty and did not have people infected with coronavirus in them. And they hadn't had people in them in over 10 days that were known to be symptomatic with coronavirus. And so you can see the red circles are places where we put passive settling dishes, where we open a plastic dish and the dust settles in, and we sample the dust and look through its RNA and see if it has coronavirus in it. And then the black circles are where we took Q-tips, glorified Q-tips, flocked swabs, and sampled surfaces. And those are all the negative locations. So those were no presence. The two dots that are filled in with red show swab locations where we did find the presence of the RNA, the bathroom floor, and interestingly and somewhat concerning, the return air grill. The blue box is the return air, the red boxes are the supply air. Next slide. We did that for another room, which you'll see even more abundance, or excuse me, more presence of the coronavirus located on floors on either side of the bed, near the sink, near the door, on the way out of the room, again on the bathroom floor. And the next slide actually shows an operating room that had never seen a coronavirus patient. And we found one sample in the corner of the room in this passive settling dish. So that gives us clues into the potential for airborne or aerosolized transmission indoors. This is the first batch of work representing about 100 samples. We've done over 1,000 samples with OHSU now. We're actively engaged with their facilities team, making changes to building operational practices and protocols with their infection control on the application of PPE, et cetera. And again, I just want to say thanks to OHSU for allowing us to do this work and share this work. It's been an amazing collaboration that I think will support a generalized knowledge of transmission risks indoors. Next slide. I think that gets us close to wrapped up. If this video plays, awesome, but it just shows the concept of what we're working on for sampling buildings at University of Oregon. Apologies about the videos. But in any regard, what we're showing here is the idea of sampling buildings. With a single sampler of an air handler, we can get a pretty good understanding about the potential exposure in that building, which we believe could help guide decisions about occupancy the next day or on a university campus. Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, we could test on Monday afternoon and decide if those rooms are safe to be occupied again, certainly before Wednesday. I would argue it's possible, theoretically possible, to do that more frequently. Riley, I think I'm about out of time, and I think I'm about out of slides.
Great, good work, staying on time. Thank you, Kevin. That was really, really interesting. So next, I'm going to bring up Kathleen Owen of Owen Air Filtration Consulting. Kathleen actually comes to us from the East Coast, which thank you for joining us. For some reason, there's Kevin's information. Here we go. Here's Kathleen's slides. So Kathleen is an air filter and cleaner filtration efficiency and test method development expert. She worked on the ASHRAE and EPA projects that developed ASHRAE air cleaner efficiency test methods 52.2 for particles, 145.2 for gases, and 185.1 UV bioaerosols. I suspect there's some ASHRAE nerds on this call, and they're probably getting real excited. She's the current chair of ASHRAE 52.2 and of the research subcommittee chair for TC 2.3 gaseous contaminants. During her 33 years at RTI International, she worked on many ASHRAE and EPA projects on air cleaning and air quality. She ran the RTI Commercial Air Cleaner Test Lab for 20 years. Her BS is in chemical engineering, is from NCSU. Is that North Carolina State? Nice, University. And her MS in air pollution control engineering is from UNC, University of North Carolina.
University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Chapel Hill, thank you. She is an ASHRAE fellow and member of the ASHRAE Epidemic Task Force. All right, Kathleen, it's on.
Okay. I'm here today to give you a little bit of background on ASHRAE and what we're doing with COVID. And I'm only supposed to talk for 5 minutes, so there's more on the slides than I'm going to talk about, but she's going to send the slides, so you should be able to read them later. Next. Next slide.
All right, it's trying to advance. Come on, there we go.
Okay, this is, if you go to, the best way is by Googling, but to the ASHRAE COVID site, the Epidemic Task Force is divided into several different groups, and I happen to be working with the Filtration and Disinfection group, and this is our front page. I highly recommend that if you're looking for HVAC type information, there's a lot of good information there, including a 33-page presentation on opening up schools that I read and was fairly pleased with. It's meant to be more slides than research paper, so there's not that much on it, but there's a lot of good information on the humidity settings and some of the things of that sort that I don't normally think all that much about. Anyway, next. So COVID-19 and airborne transmission, and so this has already been covered by the last two people to some extent, or probably better than I will, but a little bit different approach. Most of the COVID transfer that we hear about is due to droplet transfer, and they're using droplet in the sense of basically big particle, big water droplet. I think of it as splash. It's the stuff you spit out and you can kind of feel it coming from the person if you're too close to them. It's yucky. Noting that some of it is also not visible. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be really huge, but that's the stuff that gets to you within that 6 feet, and I would say 6 to 10 feet range. Because a lot of people say, well, do we know COVID is being transferred? I think having heard the last talk, I feel more confident in saying, yes, it must be, but I will be a little more cautious and say ASHRAE is still saying we're not sure, but we want to be careful because every other virus that we've ever said we weren't sure about seemed to end up being, but it might have been after the virus went past before we knew for sure. Things to think about if you want to be grossed out or useful. Infected people cough, sneeze, sing, and talk just like the rest of us. Tens of thousands of droplets can be produced in a cough or a sneeze, and tens of thousands of droplets are also produced simply by singing or talking for several minutes. So it's a lot of stuff out there, and most of it you can't tell is there. Unless you've got somebody who gives off a lot of stuff and you've got just the right light. Next slide. So droplet, the stuff that comes out of you, your mouth, your nose, they're mostly saliva and other fluids, phlegm, and I'm not a biologist, so I can say yucky stuff. But what happens is the droplet comes out and it shrinks as it dries. But it's also why, even though the virus is listed as being very tiny, the droplets you're actually seeing the COVID in are bigger than the virus. So if somebody comes at you and says, oh, it's 100 nanometers, it's too tiny to catch, there's a lot of things wrong with that statement. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Basically, first off, the bigger droplets fall out quickly or are caught in mass. That's one of the reasons why even those little cloth ones, if you cough and you get that glop, you're saving somebody else from getting it on them. Do that. So distance mask, first step. One of the recommendations that's already been talked about is ventilation, preferably with clean outdoor air. I mean, there's some areas even with the COVID, you don't really want to bring the outdoor air in. But it's been recommended that you increase your outdoor air if you can, if it's practical, if it's not August in North Carolina, or for that matter, June. They also recommend, as I believe it was Craig was talking about, at least running 3 or 4 air changes before you open a building up in the morning. And if it hasn't been occupied, to go longer. But if you pull an outdoor air with no COVID, you need to flush more than once because of those corners, and you want to make sure you get the whole room cleaned up. Next. So the important parameters in particles, the size of the particle determines how far it will go. And remember, it changes over time. So the big particles are going not all that far because the gravity pulls them out. But that same big particle may get small enough that that draft of air, the person walking past fast, the ventilation system, your fan, might pull it back in the air in order to dry out enough that it will go farther and get into your HVAC system or your lungs. How long will it stay alive? And that's a question that Kevin had some answers for. It's getting into the corners of rooms that are unoccupied. So you also have to look, as the other folks talked about, how is the building designed? Where you want to put your filtration if you're trying to clean the air depends on where the air is coming from, where your vents are, what your goal is. And you guys know schools and I don't, but I'm envisioning a bunch of kindergartners sitting in a clump. Nothing you do with the HVAC system is going to help if they're actually sitting a foot apart. You might be able to send them clean air otherwise, but that's you have to be addressing the issue, well, that you can address. There's also the question of, do you want to put in HVAC filters or do you want to put in in-room? And as always, my understanding is based on what I think at the moment, not perfect. Next. Okay, this chart that you can't read because it's a slide on your small screen is a graphic from a paper I put together many years ago, but it shows different sizes of standard particles that can get in the air or other places that I just like as a background for this. My point here today, though, is there's a lot of things in your air. COVID as the virus, though, is the light pink spot with the arrow to it, but that's running 70 to 150 nanometers is the different people reporting. But when you put it in the droplet that's getting into the air and into the HVAC system that you're going to be breathing in later, assuming you're not 6 feet from the source, it's much bigger. Think 0.5 to 5 microns, or sources are also saying even as tight as 1 to 3 microns. Not all of those particles will have virus in them and everything, but that's the range I want you to remember when we get to the slide that I'm going to talk about filters. Next. Okay, this looks familiar because we saw a graph that kind of started out from basic principles. These are filters by MERV, and MERV is the 52.2 output that tells you, it goes a scale of 1 to 16, with 16 basically being above 95%, more or less across the board, and a MERV 1 being golf balls at your front door. These curves are representative of an individual MERV. If you get a MERV filter and it doesn't match this, don't call me up, because people have been doing that this last week or so. You have to meet a certain efficiency spec to get the MERV. You can vary. I mean, one can be 80 and another can be 85 and still be in the same MERV. But all filters hit a minimum and then come back up in the other side. If you've got a filter that's 10% efficient, it's not going to come back up to 90%. But The other side of it is a lot of people are saying you need a HEPA. So I put the breakout of the HEPA. Even HEPAs have minimums. They're not at 0.3 if you're doing it by count. If you're doing it by mass, it can be at 0.3 because of the way they do the testing. But basically, if you're looking at the size range of 0.5 to 5, which is my green box, MERV 16 HEPAs, MERV 15, MERV 14, MERV 13, all of them are capable of catching a heck of a lot of it. None of them are going to catch everything a HEPA probably would, but a MERV 14, 13 is a good filter for catching a lot of it in that size range. Next. So ASHRAE is recommending MERV 13 or better if you can do it, MERV 14 preferred. Don't upgrade your filter unless you check to see first that your system can handle it. If you put a filter in that has higher pressure drop, you're either going to cause the filter to not seal and the air to go around it, your fan to die, or not enough air to go through it, which is going to mess up your energy and your heat and your humidity, all those important things. They're recommending to make sure that your filters are reasonably new. It doesn't have to be new, but if it's been in there as long as the bottom filter in my picture, change it. And when you put your filters in, or even if you're just checking your old filters because you're nervous about the COVID, check to make sure they're sealed in as much as possible. And I don't mean glue them, but make sure they're covering the hole. Make sure that if the air is on, that they're not 2 inches away. If the air goes around the filter, it doesn't clean it. To remove as much stuff from the air as possible, run your HVAC as much as possible. Clearly that has energy implications, but that is a goal. And if you have people like a lot of the people who've been calling me for assistance in the last 3 months that say, but I have to have a HEPA, remind them that HEPA often takes retrofit. You have to have a way to get it sealed in. You have to have a fan that will push through it. It does no good to put a HEPA filter into a system that can't handle it. But if your boss or your school or your whatever still really wants a HEPA, there are in-room units with HEPAs, and that's one way to meet your specification on a job. And it won't hurt. I mean, it's also a really good way to control a source. If you know for sure that all sick people are going to be in the nurse's office, it might be a good place to put an in-room unit. You know, that type of the consideration for filters. Also, don't let your kids have pillow fights in your house. They get in your filter and you can't get air through it. Next slide. UVC or UVGI. UVC is the wavelength of ultraviolet light that is germicidal. At least it's the one we talk about the most. The UV inactivates viruses rather than capturing it, but it still makes it not infectious when it works. UVC can go in HVAC ducts, or it can be upper air, which means put it on the ceilings or the walls, not next to people. If you need to increase your kill rate or your inactivation of your virus and you can't change your filter and you're really worried, it's a really good option because it doesn't have a lot of pressure drop. Next. Go look at the ASHRAE website. It's got a lot of good information. If you've got questions, do go ahead and send them in. Our task force is trying to get back to people within 24 hours, but also if you have a question, there's probably dozens of other people with the same question. And if we see the question more than a few times, we're trying to add it to the facts so it will be on the website, so you'll help other people by asking us questions. That's it for me.
Thanks, Kathleen. I love, encouraging people to ask questions because it helps other people, because that brings up my next point, that just a reminder that if you guys have questions right now or you're still kind of muddling around things, feel free to put them into the chat and we can start asking them. Time flies. So Jerry, I'm going to pass this off to you. I'll do a quick intro and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. But if you guys have a ton of questions, we will follow up with you and make sure that you get them answered. Jerry, much like Craig, is one of our devoted Green Schools Committee members. He's an Oregon-based account executive for Ameresco, a leading energy efficiency and renewables company. And Ameresco identifies, develops, funds, and implements projects for K-12 schools, universities, cities, and hospitals to cut their carbon footprint and lower overhead costs. You're going to start to see in this, by the way, this kind of energy and health nexus, where a lot of our experts, are talking about how we can impact health, but then also now how we can impact energy efficiency. I will follow up with Jerry's contact information. He has it written here for more information on energy efficiency upgrades and alternative finance energy generation options. All right, let's see. My slides are not advancing particularly quickly, but Jerry, I'll pass it off to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Riley. Hi, everybody. I'll slide over here. You can see some items back. So all the information that the previous presenters had, I kind of have as well. In fact, Kathleen was one of the big helps in our questions, which is in helping our clients, our K-12 in this group setting. How do we deal with energy efficiency, safety, healthy buildings? I mean, there's so many forces at work that our audience, which I'm looking at today, of facility managers, school board officials, school business officials, there is a lot of things coming at you right now. And we have kind of this summer to put things together and come up with a plan and answer your constituents, which are your students and the families of your students. How you're going to kind of absorb all this information and then regurgitate it back to them in a manner that makes sense, I think is a real challenge. And so the idea of this two-part webinar series was to bring on the experts like Kathleen and Craig and Kevin to kind of give you a basis of what's the science. I'm sure you're hearing a lot of things, whether that's on your Facebook site or in the newspapers, and they all seem at times to be against each other. One scientist says one thing, another says another. The updates are happening constantly. It's very easy to just kind of give up and just let it take its course. And unfortunately with COVID, that is kind of an answer that has some deadly consequences. And so as the kind of representatives from your school and responsible for their health, there are some things that we're going to need to do. So today's was on science. July's will be more on kind of practical application. So how do we take this science and use them in our own buildings to come up with our own plans? And relying on the talent at Portland Green Schools is one way. Kind of bringing in some consultants would be our recommendation over the summer to try and get your game plan in order. A lot of things that are going to happen, if they happen, on the legal side, the insurance side, the tracking side, when things go wrong. The roll-up will be, what did you do to prepare for this? And so having a really contained placeholder where you're putting all this information, and when you're really trying to almost say, this is what we did, this is the information we had, and we did the best we could, will in the court of law or in insurance or things that happen, will protect you and your school districts. So we'll get into some of that more in the next group. Riley, slide. I have a few slides here, and I'm just going to kind of stop it. I'm just going to do two. Just these are different ways of looking at the contaminants. The way we first got into it, Amoresco, we go into schools and we kind of look at your existing energy infrastructure and your buildings and find out, hey, if you upgraded a certain amount of equipment, what can we do to save energy? And then with the financing side, how can we use that savings to then fund the project? We're working with some schools down in Southern Oregon, which have, which is our new season here on the West Coast, which is the fire season. And this is a summer through October season where fire smoke is a particulate matter that's causing increased asthma, increased problems within the school. And do we get to the point of closing schools? And so we were responding to those requests in both the newly built bond, let's say, buildings of new schools, new high schools. How do we design? Craig brought that up in the beginning. How do we design from the ground up to take care of healthy schools? The other side is retrofits, right? So your existing building is there. What can we do to make it a more healthy and better environment for the kids to learn and also, for the people, the adults that work there, to have a safe working environment? So this is kind of a visualization, and again, it's as you get your kind of background together to answer questions from your parents or your school board. You know, kind of having a visual deck in front of you to be able to hand out, I think will be helpful in cutting to the information that you know. So this might be one, or you know, some collection of information to provide, I think would be a good recommendation for those looking for answers. Next slide. This is kind of, I like it. It has some of the things that Kathleen and Craig and Kevin were talking about, which is particulate size matter, right? So that's going to be a question that comes up with parents coming in and saying, you know, I think we should have HEPA filters. I think we should have MERV filters. They're going to have a little bit of information and really rely on the facility manager, the school building, the superintendent to kind of be able to accept that those questions or those seemingly easy answers, and to be able to, pardon the pun, filter that information to get good answers back. As I said before, this was something we've been working on the last couple of years for forest fires, which tend to be in that 0.3 to 0.7 micron level. From the previous slide, you can see, and from what Kathleen had said, the COVID is smaller. And so what do? You know, the answers would be, you know, let's put more filters in. But then you get into the question of, well, is our HVAC system large enough? Are our fans and VFDs set up so that they can push air through that? If not, then it's not really a solution, is it? There's some options you can do. And so I think a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to close it out, is the countervailing forces. So everything you're going to do is going to have a pro and con to it. And financing and paying for these things, as Craig talked about, the cost-benefit ratio, I think is a central concern. The other side is, this is one slice of all the information that's coming towards you. I mean, you as business managers, let's say, you have PERS, which Kathleen knows out of state is kind of our state retirement fund that is causing extra pressure on school districts to kind of resupply that with money. Health insurance takes up a big part of your budget. Labor unrest, so union activity, you know, teachers, you're looking at decreased budget from decreased revenue from tax dollars. All these things are going through, and we're coming to you with like one slice. So we realize you kind of have to put us within a larger context, but it's an important one. So as you get through going through all these things, make sure you reach out and have us, someone from an ESCO, whether it's Ameresco or others, or some consultant, PAE or whatever that is, kind of come in and help you run through that, because finding the right result as far as something that works is going to take a combination of both how much money can we retrofit it, can we do a retro commissioning, can we get our existing information up so that works, and then also cleaning those filters and having the service and support in your facility group that they do that. So I've got next slide. And then these are going to be all kind of the options, and I'll leave it at that. You can kind of go to it, you know, on your own. But Riley, if you want to just continue on through the deck till the end, just kind of see that these are some of the items that others have brought up. These are the different filters that you can use, whether that's HEPA or the MERV rated filters, using electrostatic, and you can kind of continue through, and there's pros and cons to each, and so your specialist will help you with that determination. So that was just kind of a quick, you know, we could kind of go on for this forever, but hopefully we'll see you back here in July, and we'll talk about some of the real world applications and which solution works best for you, and have some feedback from some other parts of the kind of insurance, legal, bond side of it, as well as manufacturers, and give you some resources on how to get that help for your district. And that's all I have, but it was great seeing everybody, and I'll kick it back to Riley for the close.
Thanks for bringing that home, Jerry. That was a perfect wrap up of kind of what everyone said. So we only have 6 minutes, so I'm going to run through our last super quick slides. Jerry mentioned we have a part 2. We're still looking for 1 or 2 panelists, actually. So if you're like, man, I'm really gung-ho about designing to COVID and pandemics, climate change, etc., let us know. Gosh, this is real slow at advancing today. Apologies. There's a bunch of technical resources and other resources. We will follow up with the things like the links that the videos that wouldn't play earlier, so you guys can take a peek. But we're not going to end yet. because I know some of you have questions. So I'm going to open up the line here for 5 minutes for people to ask questions. And then if the questions are still flowing, then, you know, if panelists want to stick around, that's great. And if not, we can cut it off. But you feel free to unmute yourselves. Or if you, for some reason, can't get the unmute to work, feel free to type it into the chat box. So I'll be quiet. It's always hard to be the first brave soul, isn't it?
Hey Riley, this is Natalie at O. I'll jump in with a question. I'm kind of wondering what schools can think about when they're facing outdoor air quality that isn't maybe healthy to bring into the building, whether that's from fire-related issues or just general environmental air quality, how that can be a factor in choosing systems that can have increased filtration and still mitigate COVID risks.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. It's a good question. Typically, it's mostly concerned with natural ventilation, where you don't have any filtration. A lot of fire events are releasing particulates, which is, you know, why everything kind of looks gray and brown. And so if that's running through your air handler, you're probably going to be okay. The one caveat to this that I did not mention, and this is just something general design, outdoor air quality when we're running it through a system with filtration, regardless of how great your filter is, you want to be mindful of gas phase balloons. And typically in outdoor, this is traffic-related air pollution. And so you're seeing a lot of nitrogen dioxides and all sorts of sulfates, all sorts of stuff, ozone, coming from like tailpipes. And so you want to be mindful of your intake, outdoor air intake, and its location relative to any major freeways. In Portland here, we just did a study on Harriet Tubman Middle School, where PSU has some really good data on that.
Yeah, and this is Jerry. I'll jump in as well on that because it just speaks to those countervailing forces, right? So if it's fire season that you're trying to do, you close your dampers and you're reducing air intake because that's the specific result you're trying to have. That also increases the carbon dioxide level in the room because you're not having fresh air in, which results in sleepy kids and an unpredictable, unhealthy school. And what we've seen as well is sometimes that happens, people manually shut those down and manually don't open them back up after the fire. And so I think really you have to just continually have an upgrade in your service of cleaning the filters, making sure that your system's working. The energy side of it is, hey, we want to save energy. People often close down outside air because that does allow a less variance in using your heating and cooling to monitor the same levels. So it's really up to the district to decide where's our levels of importance. You know, what's our highest? What are we really trying to achieve down to second and third tiers? So think about the solution in more than one terms of, hey, we've got to fight COVID-19. Because fighting COVID-19 will give you results that will equal, you know, higher energy use, more air intake, and which may not be the best during fire season or particulates, but may help with the transmission of COVID. So this question is never going to be easy as far as the answer. So make sure you preface any answers you're giving out to your community with that. This is a complexity, and that we're kind of balancing many things to result in a good classroom for our teachers and for our students. So you know, those are some of the things that, as I'm looking at it, every time I move in one direction, I'm kind of weakening the other agenda items. And so just finding that balance, I think, is the best that we can possibly do.
Any other panelists have anything to add? I have another question here, but if you have something to add, please do. All right. So what we're hearing a lot of is that it sounds like we need this fresh supply of outdoor air as opposed to recycling indoor air. And I apologize if this is not exactly correct. So what do we do when the fresh air or that outdoor air is not available, like Jerry mentioned with forest fires? How do we handle that? Too tough of a question.
Yeah,
My expertise is not in schools, so I can't address, because I'm not that familiar with how the HVAC systems are designed in Portland. So, but to me, if the outdoor air is bad, it depends on whether you have a system that's pulling air in and you can put filtration in for the outdoor air. Some places do and some don't. You know, put the filter in, but change it because it's going to get gunked up. If you're having odor issues, you can add carbon. You may want to take it out later because it adds more pressure drop, but that's one way to get at least some of the smells out. But that doesn't address your CO2 issue, but that is a way to be able to bring in more outdoor air. Likewise, if you've shut down the dampers and you're not bringing in outdoor air, if you circulate with the HVAC, more is going to go through the filter. And again, if you have smell issues, carbon is a good thing to add if you can handle the pressure drop. But there are some ways to clean the air up inside, but again, I don't know of a good way to then also deal with the CO2 issue. CO2 is just not something that, you know, standard carbon bed likes to take.
Hey Riley, can I input something here?
Absolutely. Hop on, Ruan.
Thanks. Hey, this is Ruan. I'm also with PE. One of the things that we've had conversations with school districts is, you know, how do you retrofit existing HVAC systems, right? And one of the recommendations that we've been making is like you can add like more 14 filters, like Kathleen recommended, like ASHRAE recommended, without affecting static pressure drops too much. We've found, and what also to Craig's point is like we've also recommended this what I would call like quote unquote a pandemic mode to these air handling units, because you don't want to design these systems to necessarily operate at these conditions all the time, right? You don't want to over design systems. So, but you know, when there is a pandemic and you need to have people in the building, maybe, you know, you allow those through a control system, allow those units to operate in 100% outside. You have to take into consideration, you know, if that's summer or the winter, that you have coils that are sized to condition. But again, to Jerry's point though, is like you can't every day you're in a type situation and you have wildfire, you don't want to go into 100% air mode. Maybe you just say, well, schools are closed for this month, right? Well, there's one month. So I think there's got to be some compromises there.
Are there any other questions from anyone on the line? Do not be afraid to hop in. Otherwise, we will end this because I'm realizing other people probably have meetings. But if you have questions, we open the line to you.
Hi, Kathleen. This is Mike Pacella from Amoresco. We had spoken earlier. Do you have a minute to chat a little bit about photocatalytic oxidation and needlepoint bipolar ionization?
Yes, if I'd unmute. What would you like to chat about it? The ASHRAE statement right now is that we are not making or taking a position on bipolar ionization, and there's a couple of other devices, but our statement is that we recommend filtration and we recommend UV. And the reasoning behind this is basically lack of good scientific data showing whether the devices work or not. And I'm being very careful not to say we don't think they work or we do think they work. The problem is the documentation of it. And beyond that, I get sued when I say too much, but I would strongly recommend, in the world of viruses that are killing people, that you be really confident of what you buy. So if you're looking at bipolar ionization or you're looking at UV-PCO, don't just use their advertising literature. Ask them for more details. They may very well have it, and that they just share it with customers and not with me. I would say I have been doing research on plugged-in gas phase air cleaners for a project, ASHRAE project, for 6 months now, and have been really trying to find that information. So but that's the issue, basically, is that the science is not shared or is not available.
Thank
If
you.
it's a more specific question, let me know.
Yeah. Hi, this is Jerry too. I'm just following up. That was Mike Pacella, my colleague, who I was remiss in not attributing those slides and research to him. So he has worked with lots of manufacturers in trying to get, like, what is the best system? And Kathleen has been helpful with him in kind of vetting those. So what we found, as Kathleen had said, is third-party verification, right? The difference between the marketing materials and the science-backed third-party verification that really gives you, as a school district, that assurance that it's going to work. So that's a little follow-up and a shout-out to Mike Pacella for his work on those slides. Thanks.
And little things like if an air cleaner says it will remove 50% of your particles in 3 days or in a month, it's not the same as in a single pass.
Any other questions? Comments?
Ask a question of Kathleen.
I hear something. It's a little faded.
Can I ask a question of Kathleen?
Absolutely.
On the UV, you mentioned that it could be in the duct system or just in the space. And having never seen any kind of implementation of this, we're able to achieve really good airflows in our office in the main areas, but I'm worried about, bathrooms, back hallways, things like that. Are these then visible and open to people, or do they need to be shielded in some way?
They absolutely have to be shielded because the UV is dangerous. But the upper room, I guess it's called, installations are aimed at being like 8 feet up on the wall or on the ceiling, and they're enclosed to the extent that as long as somebody's not climbing up on a ladder and sticking their head in the place it shouldn't be, they're safe. The air has to travel from the place where the people are up to them to get treated. So unless somebody is really trying, they're not going to get exposed to things they shouldn't be. That said, you also have to have decent air movement in your room to get them to work. The fan will work too, but the hot air does rise, so there's that. Was that the question?
I think so. I mean, again, it's a new technology. It's not something that maybe outside of healthcare that it has been implemented much.
Right. The big study on it that I keep hearing from the UV people that I should read, and I read the abstract and the conclusions, but was a study where they were using it to reduce tuberculosis, and it worked quite well. So there's some really interesting work on, virus or disease causing organisms with it. But yeah, I only started really paying attention to that particular type of application of UV just within the last 3 or 4 months myself. I've been sitting in the rooms where they talk about it, not listening to that part because I do HVAC. That was a mistake.
Right. Thank you.
Anyone else? I don't want to cut anyone off, but you're welcome to follow up with our panelists after. I know Kevin had to leave. Again, join us for part 2. Kevin actually and I were discussing offline that we would talk about HVAC implementation in schools into part 2. So get excited, get ready, and please join us. Anything else, panelists? Anything else, anyone?
Thank you for having me and for folks for coming.
Thanks for
Thank
joining
you.
from the East Coast.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. See you next month.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.